Imagine this. Your phone buzzes in the middle of the night, and you find your own name trending worldwide. Not for a clever joke, not for a viral dance, but for something darker. That's the kind of spotlight people faced during the witch trials, except their stage was the marketplace scaffold, their audience a furious mob. Think you could stomach medieval justice? Spoiler, most modern people would faint before the real show even starts. So, before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I'm always curious who's awake with me during these midnight wanderings. As the room softens around you, lean back and allow this story to unfold, an experience unlike anything you've listened to until now. The early sparks of witch hysteria don't begin with pitchforks and bonfires. They start with gossip, suspicion, and the everyday cruelty of neighbors. A child falls ill, a cow won't give milk, a storm ruins the harvest, and suddenly someone has to take the blame. That someone is usually a woman on the edge of society, poor, widowed, or simply too independent. At first, these accusations sound like whispers in the dark, but soon they grow into shouts. The church courts, already obsessed with rooting out heresy, find the perfect target in witches. Picture a small German village in the late 1400s. The townsfolk gather in the square, buzzing with the thrill of spectacle. The first accused woman, trembling in her rough wool dress, stands before a panel of solemn men with ink-stained fingers. They aren't scientists, they aren't psychologists, but they are absolutely certain that evil lurks in her eyes. Historians still argue whether the infamous book Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, was more of a bestseller manual for fear or a clumsy theological rant. But one thing is clear, it gave legitimacy to the hunt. And hunts, once started, spread like wildfire. Communities turned on themselves, turning paranoia into a civic duty. Even the quirky details stick out, like the belief that witches could steal men's, let's call them vital organs, and keep them in nests like birds. Yes, that was seriously written down. People in power used these absurdities to prove that evil was everywhere. Soon, trials became theater. The courtroom wasn't about evidence, it was about performance. If an accused woman cried too much, she was hiding guilt. If she remained calm, that was the devil giving her strength. It was a rigged game where the only certainty was suffering. Even men weren't safe. Lawyers, priests, and doctors could find themselves accused if they stepped on the wrong toes. Across France, Germany, and Scotland, the spiral of accusations fed on itself. A single case could lead to dozens, even hundreds. Entire towns emptied of women, each one dragged into dungeons on rumors alone. Remember that awkward office rumor that made you uncomfortable? Now magnify that by 1,000 and add a rack in the basement. That was life in the era of witch hysteria. Mainstream history often focuses on the big bonfires and trials, but the smaller, more intimate horrors were just as terrifying. A midwife might be accused because too many babies died during a bad winter. A healer using herbs might be declared a servant of Satan because her remedies actually worked better than the town physician's leeches. The clash between folk wisdom and church dogma left many crushed in between. And let's not romanticize the crowd. Ordinary villagers didn't just passively watch, they participated. To them, each accusation was a chance to purge evil, to cleanse the soul of their town. Imagine the twisted sense of self-righteousness. They truly believed that screaming at an old woman while she was shackled made the world safer. If irony could kill, the Middle Ages would have collapsed under its own weight. The stage was now set. Fear ruled daily life. Accusations spread like wildfire, and the machinery of torture waited just off stage. What began as rumor and gossip was about to become iron and fire, and the crowd was eager for the next act. The first sparks had caught, and the flames of hysteria were only beginning to rise. But what exactly happened when the whispers turned into a courtroom order, when the words confess or suffer became more than a threat? The answer lies in the instruments waiting in the shadows, gleaming in candlelight, and built with creativity no one should be proud of. The courtroom scribes put down their quills and the judges nod. The accused woman doesn't even get to speak. Her fate is already sealed. She is led down stone steps into a chamber colder than any dungeon in horror films, though this is no set. Iron, wood, and rope wait like silent executioners. This is where justice transforms into performance art, and the props are instruments of pain. The rack is the star of the show. Imagine lying flat on a wooden frame, wrists bound to one end, ankles tied to the other. As the crank turns, the body stretches, bones creak, and joints pop. The accused screams, which the inquisitors scribble down as evidence. Not screaming? Even worse, that means she's been hardened by Satan. Either way, the court wins. Historians still argue whether confessions extracted under torture were ever sincerely believed by the judges or simply used as convenient proof, but the machinery rolled on regardless. Then there's the thumb screw, the pocket-sized torture device that shows how even cruelty comes in different sizes. It's essentially two iron plates screwed together with the victim's fingers in between. Tighten the screw and bones crush like chalk. Some inquisitors reportedly kept thumb screws in their pockets like today's phone chargers, ready to whip out during interrogations. Quirky detail. In Scotland, people called them pillywinks, which sounds almost cute until you imagine your hand caught in one. The iron spikes come next, often attached to chairs or collars. These weren't designed to kill instantly, but to make sitting, breathing, or existing unbearable. Victims sat motionless, afraid to shift even an inch, while sharp points dug into flesh. It sounds medieval, and it is, but it also proves one uncomfortable truth. Human creativity doesn't stop at making art or inventions. It also dreams up devices whose only purpose is agony. The psychological theater surrounding these instruments is just as important. Guards parade the accused through the town square before locking them in the dungeon, letting everyone see her pale face and swollen wrists. To the villagers, it confirms her guilt. To the victim, it's the prelude to hours or days of pain. Torture chambers weren't just basements. They were echo chambers where cries bounced off stone walls, reminding other prisoners of their own looming fate. And yet, even as bodies broke, the confessions dragged on with bizarre detail. Under the rack, victims admitted to flying to Sabbaths on broomsticks, feasting with demons, or turning milk sour with a glance. It's tempting to laugh at how absurd these claims sound today, but laughter fades when we remember the stakes. Refusal to confess meant more pain, while confession meant execution. Either way, the end was near. A mainstream historical fact underscores this madness. In Würzburg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631, over 900 people were executed in one of the largest witch panics recorded. Entire families were wiped out. Even children weren't spared. Some as young as 9 faced torture until they admitted their crimes. Think about that the next time someone calls medieval Europe quaint. Of course, fringe tidbits still bubble to the surface. In some towns, interrogators sprinkled holy water over their torture devices just to ensure Satan couldn't intervene. Yes, because nothing says sanctity like blessing the thumb screws. And in a strange reversal, some accused witches supposedly begged to be tortured longer, believing that if they endured suffering without confession, God might grant them a miracle acquittal. No surprise, miracles rarely arrived. The system thrived because it was self-perpetuating. Each confession named more witches, dragging new suspects into the chamber. One tortured woman might accuse 10 others, not because she believed it, but because naming names bought her a few more breaths. Think of it like a medieval pyramid scheme, except the only currency was screams. This brings us to one of the enduring debates. Were inquisitors genuinely convinced of their holy mission, or were they cynical opportunists milking fear for power? Some argue the judges sincerely believed they were purging Satan's influence, while others see them as men hungry for control, land, or wealth. Whatever the motive, the outcome was the same. Confessions carved out of pain, and bodies discarded when their stories had served their purpose. The rituals around torture became almost ceremonial. Priests prayed while racks turned, reminding everyone this was supposedly God's justice at work. The blending of religion and violence blurred the line between salvation and sadism, and the accused, caught in the machinery, realized too late that no display of innocence would matter. Every society likes to think it has moved past its darkest moments. Yet here, in these candlelit dungeons, you can almost hear echoes of modern systems where confession under duress still happens. The instruments may look different, the uniforms may be modern, but the principle, the crushing of body to control the mind, remains unsettlingly familiar. As the crank squeals one last time, and the scribe dips his pen back into the ink, another proof of witchcraft is recorded. But racks and screws are only the beginning. Beyond the dungeon, the elements themselves, water, rope, and fire, wait to play their part in the theater of pain. The crowd outside doesn't know the details of the thumb crew or the spiked chair. What they see is simpler. A body dragged out, a sentence proclaimed, and a punishment staged for everyone to watch. And when the rope tightens or the flames roar, the spectacle will rise to its most theatrical and most horrifying heights. The dungeon doors creak open, and the accused stumbles out. She's bruised, drained, and half-dragged by guards into the open air. The crowd has been waiting, packed shoulder to shoulder in the square. This isn't just punishment. It's a live show, and everyone wants a front-row seat. Now the instruments of wood, rope, water, and fire come into play. Tools that turn executions into communal entertainment. First, the infamous swimming test. Judges tie the accused with ropes and drop her into a river or pond. If she sinks, she's innocent, though drowning is the likely result. If she floats, she's guilty, because water rejects the unholy. Imagine your neighbors applauding while you thrash around tied up, and you realize how far superstition can stretch logic. Historians still argue whether these tests were meant as true trials or simply public humiliation rituals, but the outcome rarely changed. The accused usually didn't make it out alive. Rope was versatile in this theater of fear. Hanging could be a straightforward end, but often it was delayed, staged for maximum tension. Some victims were hoisted and dropped repeatedly, suspended just long enough to gasp for breath before being hauled back up. Think of it like the cruelest roller coaster ride ever invented, but without the ticket refund. Then, of course, came fire, the ultimate purifier. Burning at the stake became the iconic image of witch trials. Villagers would gather, bringing children as though it were a festival. Vendors even sold food and drinks nearby, turning executions into grim carnivals. The victim, tied to a post, faced the flames while priests recited prayers. It's disturbing to imagine how normal this felt to those watching, as though human suffering were simply another civic ritual like harvest festivals. One mainstream fact that jolts the imagination is the 1589 mass burning in Quedlinburg, Germany, where nearly 130 people were executed as witches in a single sweep. Numbers like that reveal the scale of hysteria. It wasn't a few unlucky individuals, it was entire communities consumed by fear. Yet, the methods weren't uniform across Europe. In Scotland, witches were often strangled before being burned, a supposed mercy that reveals the twisted logic of the time. In England, hanging was the favored sentence, partly because firewood was expensive. Yes, financial practicality influenced life and death. And in Eastern Europe, rumors circulated about even stranger practices. In some Polish villages, condemned women were buried alive, their coffins nailed shut with bits of scripture. On the fringe, water rituals sometimes got even stranger. There are stories of dunking chairs, wooden seats rigged to ropes, where the accused was dunked in and out of rivers for hours. Sometimes it was called ducking or cucking, which sounds comedic until you remember the freezing water, the choking lungs, and the laughter of the crowd. The social dimension made these punishments especially cruel. People you knew, neighbors, family, children, watched your last moments. Execution wasn't just about you, it was about warning everyone else. Fail to conform, fail to obey, and this could be your fate. It's no wonder people quickly learned to silence doubts and nod along with hysteria. Survival meant complicity, and yet the records show contradictions. In some towns, crowds grew uneasy, shifting from fascination to horror. There are accounts of onlookers weeping, or even trying to rush the stake to rescue an accused woman. Historians debate whether these stories are exaggerated, but they remind us that even in an age of superstition, not every heart was hardened. Some knew the spectacle had gone too far. The rituals also carried dark humor, though unintentional. In one French case, the firewood was so damp that the execution turned into hours of smoky misery rather than a quick blaze. Villagers complained about the smell and left before the ordeal ended. Imagine your death scene being ruined by soggy kindling. It's tragic and absurd all at once. As the flames rose, the narrative solidified. Fire wasn't just punishment, it was purification. By burning witches, society believed it was cleansing itself, restoring balance. It's chilling how this logic echoes in modern times whenever scapegoats are sought, whether in politics, media, or online mobs. The tools have changed, but the pattern, fear-feeding spectacle, remains hauntingly familiar. And so, Bodies swung from ropes, floated in rivers, and burned in squares, while scribes recorded names and priests declared justice fulfilled. But the cruelty didn't stop with ropes and flames. Behind closed doors, hidden in workshops and blacksmith forges, even stranger devices awaited, the kind that sound too bizarre to be real, yet were very much a part of the witch-hunting arsenal. If iron spikes and firewood were brutal, the contraptions ahead would reveal a creativity and cruelty that makes even hardened historians shake their heads. The next chamber of horrors isn't about public spectacle, it's about the private devices engineered to make suffering both inventive and unforgettable. The crowd disperses after the flames die down, but the story doesn't end in the public square. Behind monastery walls, in castle dungeons, and in secret chambers beneath town halls, there are devices so strange they sound like the props of a horror movie director, yet they were real, hammered together by blacksmiths and approved by clerics, all in the name of extracting truth from witches. If the rack and the rope were blunt instruments, these contraptions were exercises in twisted imagination. Take the witch's chair. At first glance, it looks almost ordinary, a heavy wooden seat with armrests, but the seat, back, and arms bristle with iron spikes. Once a victim is strapped in, even the smallest movement drives those points deeper into skin. Some versions had holes beneath the seat, so fires could be lit underneath, slowly roasting the accused while she sat immobile. The cruelty lies in its mockery of comfort, a chair that punishes the simple act of sitting down. Quirky fact: in some German towns, these chairs were displayed in public squares between trials, as if advertising upcoming shows. Nothing like a medieval version of coming attractions. Then there's the Pear of Anguish, a device both ridiculous in appearance and horrifying in purpose. Shaped like a metal fruit with petals, it was inserted into the mouth, or, in crueler cases elsewhere, and then cranked open. The wider it spread, the greater the agony. Historians still argue whether it was truly used for torture or more as a symbolic threat, since the mechanics would have caused gruesome injuries. But the very idea that someone designed it, forged it, and handed it to an inquisitor is disturbing enough. And who could forget the scold's bridle, sometimes called the brank? This was essentially a metal cage fitted over the head with a gag piece, sometimes spiked, that pressed down on the tongue. Officially, it was meant for nagging or gossiping women, but during witch hunts, it silenced the accused in courtrooms and streets. Imagine being paraded through town wearing a metal muzzle while everyone laughed. A strange detail: some bridles were decorated with devilish engravings, turning humiliation into carnival mockery. Other devices took subtler forms. Iron boots or Spanish boots encased the legs. Then wedges were hammered between the metal and the shin until bones cracked. The sounds alone must have been unbearable. Then there was the strappato, which sounds like an Italian dessert but is anything but sweet. Victims had their hands tied behind their backs and were hoisted by ropes until their shoulders dislocated, dropped them suddenly, and the pain multiplied. The design is simple, but the effect is devastating. These instruments weren't just about pain, they were about theater. Interrogators selected tools that fit the accusation. A woman accused of using her tongue for curses. She might face the bridle or the pear. Someone suspected of flying? Ropes and weights tested her endurance. It was a grotesque parody of justice, tailored cruelty disguised as divine order. A mainstream historical fact underscores the point. In Bamberg, Germany, a prince bishop known as Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim oversaw a witch trial system so elaborate that he built a Drudenhaus, a dedicated witch prison filled with custom torture devices. Over 600 people died under his reign, their confessions squeezed out by iron and fire. This wasn't random mob violence, it was bureaucracy weaponized, yet the fringe tidbits revealed just how bizarre it all became. Some towns swore by the use of witch pricking, where professional witch-finders jabbed suspects with long needles to find the devil's mark. Supposedly, a witch wouldn't feel pain where the mark was. In reality, the needles were sometimes retractable, creating the illusion of a painless stab. Yes, con artists literally traveled town to town, stabbing terrified women for profit. The debate still lingers. Were these devices ever used as extensively as the legends claim, or have later storytellers exaggerated their horrors? Some historians suggest the Pear of Anguish, for instance, may have been more of a symbolic prop, like a weapon of intimidation. but others point to court records describing its deployment in lurid detail. The truth may never be fully settled, leaving us caught between skepticism and horror. What's undeniable is the psychological shadow they cast. Picture yourself in the cold chamber, candlelight flickering on metal contraptions arrayed like surgical instruments. The interrogator doesn't have to use them all. He only has to let you imagine what they could do. That imagination alone could break stronger wills than any crank or screw. Even in their grotesquerie, the devices reflect something disturbingly human, the drive to innovate. People who could have designed water wheels or bridges instead poured energy into inventing tools of torment. It's a reminder that creativity itself isn't moral, it depends on where it's directed, and in this case, it was directed straight into darkness. By the time the victim staggered out of these secret chambers, if she survived, her words carried the weight the judges wanted. Confessions, no matter how impossible, became truth once stamped with pain. And those truths went on to fuel more trials, more accusations, and more deaths. But the trials themselves couldn't last forever. The tide would eventually turn, though not before entire regions were scarred. And as the smoke cleared and the devices gathered dust, questions remained. What had this frenzy revealed about human nature? Why had fear and spectacle triumphed over reason? Those echoes didn't vanish. They shaped the laws, cultures, and imaginations that followed. The fires may have burned out, but the ashes carried a story too heavy to be forgotten. And in those ashes, the uneasy silence grew, whispering that the real horror wasn't the devices themselves, but the society that applauded their use. The firewood is gone, the racks stand silent, and the iron chairs gather dust in forgotten basements. Yet the echoes of the witch trials never fade. They cling like smoke to Europe's history, drifting into law codes, cultural memory, and even the way societies still chase shadows today. To understand the true weight of these trials, one must step beyond the screams of torture chambers and listen instead to the quieter, longer-lasting voices. The laws rewritten, the cultures reshaped, the lessons ignored. At first glance, the witch trials seem like distant relics, just another barbaric chapter in the endless scroll of human cruelty. But peel back the layers, and the consequences ripple far beyond the 16th and 17th centuries. Thousands of lives were lost, entire towns traumatized, and generations grew up knowing that suspicion alone could condemn you. This fear didn't vanish when the flames dimmed. It soaked into the soil of Europe's conscience. A mainstream historical fact underscores the scale. Historians estimate between 40,000 and 60,000 executions occurred across Europe between 1450 and 1750, with perhaps hundreds of thousands more imprisoned, tortured, or ruined by accusation. Numbers like that aren't just statistics. They reveal a continent obsessed, terrified, and at times intoxicated by its own hysteria. Compare it to modern witch hunts, cancel culture, scapegoating minorities, or political purges, and the unsettling parallels emerge. The tools may have changed, but the rhythm of fear remains stubbornly familiar. One lingering effect was legal reform. The sheer excess of the trials eventually forced courts to reconsider evidence. By the late 1600s, judges in places like France and England began rejecting spectral evidence, visions, dreams, and ghostly testimonies. They realized, perhaps reluctantly, that law built on rumor collapses under its own weight. This pivot helped shape the Enlightenment's emphasis on rational justice, though it came at a terrible cost. Historians still argue whether the witch trials hastened this modernization of law or merely delayed it by centuries. Culturally, the memory of witches lingered long after the gallows emptied. Folktales, ballads, and whispered warnings carried the image of the witch into the modern imagination. Sometimes she appeared as a cackling crone, sometimes as a seductress, but always as a figure of suspicion. This duality reflects the original trials. Women were feared both for being too weak and too powerful, too poor and too wealthy, too quiet and too outspoken. In other words, the definition of witch was simply a woman who inconveniences society. Even fringe tidbits survived into modern culture. In parts of rural Germany, locals carried iron nails in their pockets well into the 19th century, believing they repelled witches. And in Scotland, stories persisted of witch stones, marked with natural holes, hung in cottages as protection against curses. These talismans reveal how the trauma of centuries didn't vanish. It mutated into superstition disguised as tradition. The witch trials also left scars on families and communities. Accusations didn't just kill individuals, they destroyed lineages. Lands were confiscated, names smeared, and descendants lived under shadows for generations. Imagine being the granddaughter of a woman burned at the stake. Even decades later, that stigma clung like a curse, more real than any alleged spell. Some modern researchers studying parish records still trace abrupt disappearances of surnames, suggesting entire bloodlines were wiped out by a few whispered words. And yet, irony abounds. While women were persecuted for supposed pacts with Satan, the real deal with the devil was made by the institutions that sanctioned torture in the name of God. Priests, judges, and rulers legitimized cruelty to preserve authority, and in doing so exposed the fragility of their own systems. By clinging to fear rather than reason, they planted seeds of skepticism that would eventually bloom into challenges against church and monarchy alike. In America, the echoes crossed the Atlantic. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 may have been smaller in scale, but their notoriety ensured the legacy of European hysteria lived on in the New World. 20 executions and hundreds of accusations showed that the disease of suspicion traveled well. What's fascinating is that Salem occurred just as Europe was beginning to retreat from witch hunts, suggesting America was still catching the fever late. Today, Salem is shorthand for mass panic, a reminder that geography doesn't immunize societies against irrational fear. But the story doesn't end with historical curiosity. Witch trials became metaphors. Political purges in the 20th century, from McCarthyism in the United States to Stalinist show trials in the Soviet Union, borrowed the language of witch hunts because the structure was identical. Accuse, isolate, extract confessions under pressure, and eliminate inconvenient individuals. The phrase survives in headlines today, often misused, but its roots remain in those burning squares. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why does humanity keep repeating the cycle? Why do societies invent witches, whether literal or metaphorical, when threatened? Scholars suggest it's because fear provides cohesion. A common enemy, even an imaginary one, unites fractured communities. The witch trials, horrific as they were, gave towns the illusion of control during times of famine, plague, or political turmoil. Better to blame an old widow for the cow's death than to admit your farming system is collapsing. It's here the open debate grows loud. Were witch trials simply eruptions of collective madness, or were they calculated tools of power by elites? Some historians argue the hunts were driven from the ground up, neighbors turning on neighbors out of envy, spite, or desperation. Others see them as top-down campaigns, orchestrated by rulers to distract populations and consolidate authority. The truth may be a blend, but either way, the result was the same. Fear weaponized until reason drowned. And yet, it would be dishonest to end this narrative on despair alone. Out of the ashes, progress did emerge. The Enlightenment, the rise of scientific skepticism, and the eventual recognition of women's rights all unfolded partly in reaction to the horrors of the witch hunts. The trials became cautionary tales, reminders of what happens when belief outruns evidence. Even today, when courts demand rigorous proof and societies, at least in principle, reject torture, we are living in the shadow of those reforms. The cultural legacy also shifted. Over centuries, the figure of the witch transformed from villain to icon. By the 20th century, she appears in children's stories, Halloween costumes, and even as a feminist symbol of independence and resistance. What once terrified societies now empowers them. The same archetype that priests condemned has become a rallying cry against repression. Irony, it seems, never dies. Still, the uneasy truth remains. The witch trials remind us how thin the line is between justice and hysteria. Strip away reason, and any society can descend into its own witch hunt. The past is not as distant as it feels. After all, it wasn't the devil who invented racks, thumb screws, or pyres. It was ordinary people, not so different from us, caught in the intoxicating mix of fear and certainty. The echoes beyond the ashes, then, are not just about witches. They are about humanity itself, our capacity for cruelty, our hunger for spectacle, and our desperate need for scapegoats. Remember those villagers who brought children to watch a burning, or the inquisitors who blessed thumb screws with holy water? They were not monsters. They were ordinary, convinced they were righteous. That is the darkest legacy of all. And yet, here you sit, listening centuries later, cushioned by modern life, maybe sipping tea or scrolling through comments. You have the luxury to judge, to shake your head at the madness of the past. But ask yourself honestly, when fear grips your own society, when rumors spread faster than reason, will you stand apart or join the crowd? The flames have died, the ash has settled, but the whisper remains. The witch hunt is never truly over. It simply changes costume, waiting for the next stage. The fires grow quiet now. The shouting crowds fade. The racks and ropes dissolve into shadows, and only silence remains. Your breathing slows, the images retreat, and history softens into memory. The story of the witch trials no longer screams. It lingers, whispering at the edges of your thoughts. Let the tension drain away, as if the weight of centuries lifts from your shoulders. These tales of hysteria and pain have served their purpose for tonight. They remind us that humanity has stumbled before, that fear has shaped decisions we now regret, and that strength often lies not in accusation, but in compassion. The world you live in is far from perfect, but it is brighter, calmer, and more forgiving than the candlelit chambers we just walked through. Picture yourself stepping out of those dark stone dungeons into the cool air of dawn. The sky lightens not with fire, but with gentle sun. The smell of smoke is gone, replaced by fresh earth and the quiet promise of a new day. You are no longer an onlooker at a trial. You are simply yourself, safe in your own time, free to reflect without fear. Allow each breath to grow longer, slower, and softer. Let the harsh edges of this history blur into calm. Tonight, the stories of torture are behind you, sealed back into their centuries, leaving only the lesson of vigilance and the reassurance of survival. And as you drift into rest, let this thought carry you. Fear builds walls, but truth and kindness slowly wear them down. The witch trials ended eventually, and so too does every fever of hysteria. Next time, we'll wander into another corner of history where the night keeps its secrets and the past still murmurs to the present.